Ralph Ellis, welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you again, Russell.
Following 25 years of research, Ralph Ellis theorizes that Jesus was a prince of Edessa in northern Syria, and the Edessan monarchs were Nazarene Jews who helped build the Temple of Jerusalem. Why is Jesus missing from the historical record? Was Jesus actually a Syrian king? What is the true identity of Josephus Flavius? What did the real crown of thorns look like? All of these questions and many more will be answered in today's program with Ralph Ellis. He's here with us to discuss his book, Jesus, King of Edessa. In further detail, we did this interview many years ago. To this day, it's hugely popular. So we're carrying on with the discussion to answer some of your questions posted in the forums and comment sections. To learn more about Ralph Ellis, visit edfu-books.com, edfu-books.com. Ralph, let's get the audience up to speed. Was Jesus Christ actually a Syrian king?
Yes, in that he lived in Syria at that time, but that was not his ancestry. So his ancestry was part Egyptian, part Roman, and part Persian. So he was a king of the known world, which is probably why he was so famous and so influential in his era. That's why the Persian Magi came to his birth, because he was half Persian. So, he was originally from the Egyptian dynasty, but the Egyptian dynasty in the first millennium BC had become weakened and had been taken over by Rome and by Greece, and so now this was a part Greek, part Egyptian, part Roman monarchy that took over most of the East as well. So yes, he was a very famous king in that era.
Why is Jesus missing from the historical record?
Well, I don't think they want to know who he was. I can't believe that I'm the first person to have seen the links that I've made in these books. And in fact, I know I'm not the first person, because if you read Arthurian history, it's quite clear that the Arthurian historians knew this story as well. But the story that they found and the story that I found is very heretical, because it doesn't agree with the classical interpretation of the life of Jesus. It doesn't agree with the gospel version. And therefore it's heretical. And therefore, within the Catholic Church, how can you acknowledge it? Even if you found it, there are undoubtedly some very good scholars within Catholic tradition, within Church of England tradition, who probably would have seen what I've seen. But how could they admit it? How could they actually write about it? How could they reveal it to their students? It's just it's too heretical. So I think various people down through the ages have seen this material and have just turned a blind eye. They've looked the other way. And that's why Jesus is missing from the historical record, because nobody wants to find him. Because the Jesus they find is very different. He becomes a real monarch. He becomes a very wealthy monarch, a very powerful monarch, and he becomes a warrior monarch as well. And none of that sits very well with the gospel story. And so it took someone like myself, who's atheist agnostic, to write about this subject, because it doesn't matter to me whether Jesus was a pauper prince of peace or whether he was a warrior monarch. He's still a historical character to me. And to me, the Jesus I found in the historical record is more believable than the one they've tried to sell within the gospel story. But it's still heretical in terms of Christian tradition, that's for sure.
When you say the historical record, what are you referring to? There's no... well, listen, there's no such thing as an official historical record. History is a collection of testimonies. How do you consider the legitimacy of one over another?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, a very difficult problem for any historian, really. You have to realize that every chronicle has been written with a particular political bias to it, the same as it is today. You've only got to look at modern events on the BBC or CNN and then compare them with the same events that are given on RT, the Russian television news service. And you'll get two completely different stories, versions of the same story. And we have the same in history as well. Now, our main historian guide for this era and this location, Judea 1st century, is Josephus Flavius. But you have to remember that Josephus was writing for the Romans, and so everything he has a Roman slant to it. And you have to take that into account. And this is why I think this particular monarchy that we were talking about, the Jesus monarchy, is pretty much missing from the historical record. Because it didn't suit the Romans, just as it didn't suit the Catholic Church. It didn't suit the Romans to talk about this particular monarch, because this particular monarch was actually fighting against the Romans at one point. And so they deleted him from history. Well, they didn't quite delete him. They changed his name a little bit. And so it's not quite so obvious who this character was. And we would have lost him completely if it wasn't for the Armenian and Syriac historians. Now, Armenia and Syria were cut off from the Roman world for more than 1,000 years. Certainly ever since the Muslim invasions of the 8th century, and even really since the Council of Chalcedon, which was in the 5th century, which cut off the Syriac Church from the Western Catholic Church. And so Syriac history has been totally divorced and separated from our modern history for, 1,300 years or more. And it just so happens that they have a different perspective on the same story. So they tell the same stories that Josephus Flavius talks about, but from the Syriac perspective, not the Roman perspective. And they call these characters, these very same characters, by their original names, which we now know from the historical record was their original names. And so the original name of this king was actually King Abgarus, who is a king that Josephus Flavius never mentions once, because he's deleted that name from the whole of his chronicle. But the Syriac historians have preserved it. And so if we look between the two of these chronicles of the 1st century, you'll get somewhere approximating to the truth. A good example is the battle with Aretas of Petra. This is the battle that was to do with John the Baptist. You remember when John the Baptist had his head cut off. This was a big political event. It wasn't just John the Baptist. It was a criticism about the marriage of one of the Herod kings, that his marriage was illegal, and he divorced his previous wife in order to illegally marry his next wife. And the previous wife that he divorced was a daughter of King Aretas of Petra. So he got upset and got together an army and went to fight the Agrippa kings in Judea. Now, that's the background to the story. Now, the way Josephus tells it is that Aretas came to fight in Judea against the Herodians, and he was assisted by some fugitives from Syria. And that's Josephus' story. So these extra combatants that came into this battle were fugitives from Syria. But if you look in if you look into the Syriac record of the same events, it says that the extra combatants from Syria was King Abgarus of Edessa. So now we get the full story. So Josephus does tell the story, but he deliberately distorts it. And you can only see the true story if you take all of the information that we have, including the Syriac historians.
What is the true identity of Josephus Flavius?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, that is, because we don't fully know who Josephus was. He gives us a genealogy which takes us back to the Hasmoneans. And he was obviously royal. He says he was of royal blood himself and well educated. He was a Jew. And he was said to be born in Tarsus, which is in southern Turkey. But he was obviously closely linked to this Edessan monarchy that we've just been talking about. And he's linked in several respects. In my books, I have linked Josephus with Saul Paul, the apostle. So one of the central components within my books is that the apostle Saul, Paul, was actually Josephus Flavius. And there are many reasons for thinking that. But in doing so, that links both Saul and Josephus with this Edessan monarchy, because the ambassador of the Edessan monarchy, the ambassadors of the Edessan monarchy, were Saul and Barnabas. And we get that from Acts 11:28, which says that King Abgarus gave relief money to Judea, and it was taken to Judea by Saul and Barnabas, the two apostles. So we can see how close these gospel stories are to the history of Edessa. And of course, if Saul is Josephus Flavius, which is something I've said, 15, 20 years ago now. It's back in 97, I think it was. If Saul is Josephus Flavius, then obviously Josephus Flavius was linked to this Edessan monarchy as well. And he seems to link himself into this Edessan monarchy on several occasions. And he does so like when he's told by Vespasian to write his books and take them to the Babylonian Jews beyond the Euphrates. And you've got to think, hold on a minute, who are the Babylonian Jews who are beyond the Euphrates? Well, the Babylonian Jews are the Jews who came out of Persia, and that was the Edessan monarchy. And their capital city was Edessa, and that was beyond the Euphrates. So it seems fairly clear that Josephus Flavius, when he wrote his Jewish War, the first place he took it to was Edessa, the city of Edessa, the city of King Abgarus. So, yes, Josephus Flavius was very closely linked to this monarchy, to this Edessan monarchy, and therefore closely linked with the gospel story. And of course, he wrote an entire version almost of the gospel story, because that is what Jewish war is. So his primary combatant that he was facing within his Jewish war was a person called Jesus of Gamala. And of course, in the biblical version of the same events in the Gospel of Acts, we have the same, that Saul was fighting against the biblical Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's the same story, but one is a secular historical story, the Jewish war, and the other is a more fanciful story covered in fairy dust, as I call it, which is the gospel story. But it's the same story.
Some people in the audience are wondering why we're saying Josephus Flavius and not Flavius Josephus.
Yes. Yeah, I've reversed it around to how it should be, because that fits in with all of the other titles that we use. The Romans had a different way of arranging the titles. So really it should be Flavius Josephus. But all of the titles we use in the modern world, and many of the titles in the ancient world, were the name and then the title. And obviously Flavius was a title that he picked up when he started working for Vespasian. So Josephus was the name, Flavius was the title. So I put Flavius afterwards. It's not kosher Roman way of doing it, but to me it makes more sense. So we have Josephus Flavius, and then we have Abgarus Carma, because that was his title.
What did the real crown of thorns look like?
Yeah, it's not quite what we would normally expect. Obviously, the Catholic Church version has Jesus as being a pauper Prince of Peace, and therefore he's a pauper, he's not rich, and they've made this crown that looks like a crown of brambles. But he wasn't. That was the wrong Jesus, as it were. The Jesus I've discovered within this historical research is a powerful, wealthy monarch, and therefore he would have had a proper crown. And in this era, we did have crowns of thorns. I mean, one of the most dramatic, I suppose you might call it, is the crown of some of the Seleucid Greek kings, who had a crown of spikes, because these spikes were the rays of the sun. So if you can imagine the Statue of Liberty with her spikes on the top of her head, they are there for the same reason. Those are the spikes of the rays of the sun coming out of her head. And some of the Seleucid monarchs from the 1st century had a very, very similar crown. Now, the one that the biblical Jesus had, so this is Jesus of Edessa now, and his name was Esus instead of Jesus. So his name was Esus Manu, the king of Edessa. And the Edessan crown was, well, I liken it to an omphalos stone. So it's a domed crown on top of his head, very similar to actually some of the crowns that the papacy use in Rome. So if you think of a papal crown, some of the sort of more 19th century ones, which were domed, very ornate, elaborate crowns with 2 tassels coming down the back, which is exactly the same as the Edessan crown had the 2 tassels coming down the back as well. So, but on the top of this crown, superimposed along its ridge, were a series of thorns. Now, we say thorns because that's sort of what they look like, but I'm not entirely convinced that they are actually thorns. To me, they look more like leaves or feathers. And I've got a suspicion they could be feathers, because this omphalos stone, which looks very, very similar to this domed crown or mitre, was very closely linked to the phoenix, and the feathers of the phoenix were a special component of the phoenix symbology. So I'm just wondering if these thorns might actually be phoenix feathers, because they don't look like thorns from any sort of plant. They could be, as I say, they could be feathers, they could be leaves, but they're certainly not thorns. But anyway, so we have a monarch who was crucified after the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, and we have this from Josephus Flavius, who would have been wearing a crown of thorns. And so this is the same story, quite obviously. This is where the tradition came from. And in fact, it's closer than that, because in the biblical tradition, it says a plaited crown of thorns, a plaited crown of thorns. And that's exactly the same as we see on the crown of Edessa, which is also plaited or plated. So it's quite obviously the same crown, which confirms that this is the correct king. Jesus was a king of Edessa. It's quite obvious.
Comment from the audience. Jesus was an Orthodox Jew. Jesus was a military revolutionary. Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus was a prophet. Jesus was gay. Jesus was the son of a Roman soldier. Jesus is a Roman invention. Jesus was a king. Jesus was the Antichrist. It doesn't matter who you are or what you believe, there's a Jesus for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. However, none of those particular Jesuses that people believe in, obviously, because I've seen the same comments on the internet and in various books, none of those Jesuses have much in the way of evidence. Even things like Jesus was the son of a Roman soldier, it's just because there was a name in the Talmud called Pantera. But it doesn't really link Jesus into a soldier called Pantera. I have a completely different interpretation on what Pantera means. So none of these descriptions of these Jesuses have any historical proof or evidence. What I have is a Jesus who's very, very similar to the biblical Jesus in every respect, that does have historical evidence, a lot of historical evidence. We know who this guy was. Unfortunately, we don't have his tomb or anything like that, but we do know who this guy was. We probably even have his coinage as well, with his image on the coins. So this is a real historical monarch, a real historical character. And not only that, his life story and his family life story are identical to the biblical story. So it seems highly likely that this is the prototype upon which the gospel versions were written. And all they've done with the gospel versions is taken this real history, and as I said before, they sprinkled fairy dust on it, because this was a Roman story, and the Romans didn't want a rebellious king being the hero of any religion. And so they had to turn this rebellious, very rich, wealthy king who started a war against Rome, they had to turn him into something different. And they certainly didn't want people knowing that anyone could start a revolt against Rome. So what they turned him into was a pauper prince of peace. And suddenly he was not against the Romans. He was saying, oh, you must pay your Roman taxes. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Because that's what Rome wanted. And so this new version of the same story became a very Rome-friendly version of this story. And hence we get this gospel-type story. But, this is a new version of this Jesus. And as you said, we've had many before, but this is a real version with real history behind it.
Question from the audience. I don't get something. If Saul was Josephus, then why hadn't Josephus written anything about Jesus in his antiquities books?
Well, actually he did. He wrote an awful lot about Jesus. You just need to know who Jesus was. So the first thing we have to get rid of is the Testimonium Flavium. So there is 2 paragraphs about Jesus, but that is an interpolation by Eusebius. So that is a text that's been put into his books at a later date by Eusebius. So they are not real. But once you take those out, of course, everyone looks at Josephus' work and says, well, he doesn't mention Jesus. But of course he does, because in 2 respects, and they are the same person actually. The main combatant, remember Josephus Flavius was an army commander in charge of Galilee in the AD 60s. The main person he was contending with was Jesus. So there's this big battle between him and Jesus. And this is where I say we have this commonality with the biblical story where Jesus himself says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's the same story, because the main combatant against Josephus Flavius was a man called Jesus. Jesus of Gamala. And of course, the Gamala surname or title is the same as the title used by the Edessan kings, who also called themselves Gama. So Jesus would have been called, the Edessan king Jesus would have been called Jesus of Gama. And of course, in Josephus' works, the person he is fighting is called Jesus of Gamala. It's the same person, it's the same name. And he also calls this very same person Esus. He calls him King Esus of the Adiabeni. So the whole of his book, Jewish War, is about this battle with this Jesus character. Why will nobody accept that as being the biblical Jesus? Well, because all of this happened in the AD 60s. And of course, any classical Christian will say, well, that can't be Jesus because that's the AD 60s. You're talking about the wrong era. So that's not Jesus. That's somebody else entirely. But this is where we come back to the chronological chasm. The whole of the gospel story has been moved back into the AD 30s because the Romans didn't want you to know that this was a story about the Jewish revolt. And the easiest way to separate this story from the Jewish revolt is to put it back one generation into the AD 30s. But it wasn't an AD 30s story because it doesn't fit in the AD 30s story. It fits in the AD 60s story. And I was just looking actually at Eisenman again because it's a while since I've read Eisenman. And he says exactly the same thing. He says he was doing his research on Saul and Saulus, and Eisenman says, and this is paraphrased because Eisenman never uses two words when he can use 100. So Eisenman says, Acts of the Apostles transposes the stoning of James in the AD 60s with the stoning of Stephen in the AD 40s. And likewise, Josephus Flavius transposes the riots of Saul in the 40s with the riots of Saulus in the AD 60s. And so what Eisenman is trying to say is they've got the dates muddled, and this is why you have these two similar stories in the AD 60s and the AD 40s. But that's not the real reason at all. It's been a deliberate movement of the entire story back into the AD 30s and the AD 40s to cover up what was actually going on, what these events were really about. Another good one is online. I'm not sure she's written a book or not, but there's a Swedish lady called Einhorn who has done an analysis of everything I've done and put it out graphically. So she's analyzed all of these duplicated events within Josephus and within the gospel story. And she comes out with this graph, and it has this big peak on the AD 30s of all these similar events, and this big peak in the AD 50s and AD 60s of comparable events within the two stories. Why do we get these two peaks? Well, because the story has been deliberately put back into the AD 30s. But if you take it out of the AD 30s and slam it back into the AD 60s, which is where it belongs, suddenly you can find the biblical Jesus, because all these mentions within the works of Josephus of Jesus of Gamala and Esus of the Adiabeni, they are the biblical Jesus. This is the character from Edessa. This is the very Jesus, Esus, the king of Edessa. But he was an AD 60s king. So in answer to that question, Josephus does mention Jesus. He gives us the whole history of Jesus in the AD 50s and 60s. But only if you can understand who that character really was.
There's a follow-up to that. Also, is Ralph Ellis's theory the same as Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah?
No, because, well, firstly, Atwill says that this is mythology, as far as I understand his books. And so it's been a made-up story. And he says it's been made up by Vespasian. And I'm not entirely sure that he ever says that it was made up by Josephus Flavius, because that's the most obvious thing. If you're going to say it's mythical, and it's in the AD 60s, you should really be saying that the story was invented by Josephus Flavius for the Flavian emperors, for Vespasian. And I'm not entirely sure, from reading Atwill, I'm not entirely sure that he does actually say that, but that would be the most obvious thing to say. But even if you did say that, you're missing half the story, because this is not a fictional story. It is a real story. And well, one of the reasons we know it's a real story is because it's mentioned in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is this enormous great book of Judaic history and law, mostly law, I suppose, and prophecy and various other weird goings on within Judaic history. But within the Talmud does mention Jesus on a number of occasions. It mentions him by name as Yeshu, they call him. And it also mentions him in code, which various Talmudic scholars have actually said that these are references to Jesus. So these are Pesher code. They've used characters in the past who have similar histories to Jesus, and they use these Old Testament characters as a cover for the name of the real Jesus. And there is no reason whatsoever for the Judaic rabbis to be talking about a fictitious character. So if this Jesus character had been invented by Vespasian or invented by Josephus, there would be absolutely no reason for the Judaic rabbis to have a commentary on him. The fact that he exists within the Talmud, as does Mary Magdalene and various other characters from the gospel story, means that they must have been writing about real characters. And I would concur with that, because the evidence is very, very strong that these were indeed real characters. They were, in fact, and it took a lot of time to find this, because it took the whole of the King Jesus trilogy to find this, because I started off with finding a possible ancestry from Rome and Egypt going into Persia, and then I found all of the links with Josephus and Saul together, and then I found all of the links with Jesus and Jesus of Gamala together, and then the links with Jesus, but we had no idea who Jesus was, because he doesn't really exist outside the works of Josephus. And then finally, in Jesus, King of Edessa, I found the links with the Edessan monarchy. And the reason that all took so long was because Edessa has been deleted from history. If you read Josephus, who's the main historian of this region and this era, he never mentions Edessa once. It's been completely deleted from history. And so it took an awful long time to get to a point where I could tie in all the links and say, right, this story does exist. We know it's a real story about real people. And at last, I found out who they are. So they're not these semi-fictitious characters that Josephus writes about, called Isis of Adiabeni, which is a fictitious place in Iraq somewhere. No, these are real characters, and they are the kings of Edessa, and we have their history from the Syriac historians. So Atwill is on the same path, but he missed a lot of tricks on the way. He missed, as far as I can see, the obvious links with Josephus Flavius writing the story, and he missed the obvious links that these are real characters and not mythical characters. So Atwill's only got 30% of the story, maybe a bit less, 25.
Question from the audience. Ralph, do you entertain the idea that Jesus was Caesarian, the only son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, and the rightful heir to the Roman throne and Egyptian throne at the same time?
Yeah, I've seen this one before as well, and there's reasons to be thinking that because of these links back to Egypt and back to Rome that are apparent within these stories. But I looked at that a long time ago and I thought, no, it's completely the wrong era. So it's really stretching history. You'd have to put Jesus back into the 1st century BC. You'd have to say he was born in, I don't know, AD 40 BC or something. So the chronology just simply doesn't work. And that would have lied dormant, I think, if it wasn't for a Victorian book. And the Victorians, I have to say, are much better historians than modern historians. They certainly knew their history a lot better than modern historians, and they appear to be less constrained by the consensus. So you get a lot of Victorian books that are much more speculative than you would ever get within modern history. And anyway, there was this one book who said something very similar to this, that he was trying to link it into Caesarian to Caesar. And he mentioned that there was a lost daughter of Caesar and Cleopatra who was called Queen Thea Musa Aurania. And again, the listeners might say, who? Just as I said who, because I'd never heard of her. I don't think anyone else has, really. She's another lost character within our history because she's too controversial for anyone really to be talking too much about her. Josephus does mention her very just fleetingly. He calls her Thermusa. But even Josephus was dismissed as being inventing new characters, that this was a fictitious character, until her coins started turning up in Persia. And so now we know she was a real character. But what modern historians have never done, and what this Victorian historian did, was link Thea Musa back to this lost daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And I think the story is correct because it has an awful lot of evidence pointing in that direction, that she was a lost daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And this is the matriarch of the Edessan royal family. Because although she became a queen of Persia, this was probably in about 20 BC, something like that. She became the queen of Persia. But she was thrown out of Persia in AD 4. And so here we have this biblical-style nativity story of a royal family in a state of poverty, on the move, being thrown out of a country or whatever, and having to find a stable in order to stay the night and have the birth of this son. And also this son being visited by the Persian Magi, the 3 kings. Because why else would the Persian priesthood be interested in a Jewish birth in Syria? That there has to be some Persian element in this story, and there was. So, no, I don't subscribe to this Caesarian story because it's just totally the wrong era. The chronology doesn't work. But if we take the lost daughter, so this would be the younger daughter to Caesarion, the next child down from Caesarion, who's not mentioned very much. And she was sold off to this king in Persia. Now we get the same story that does work because we go down 2 generations before we arrive at the Jesus character. 3 generations. We go down to Thea Musa, we go down to her daughter, who was Queen Helena, and then we go down to her son, which was the Jesus character, the king of Edessa. So the story does work, but we need another couple of generations in between before we can get it to match. And as it happens, history does give us those 2 extra generations.
Two comments, and they're linked, so I'll say them back to back. The name Jesus was a common name in those days, like saying Mohammed in England today. Perhaps there was a king named Jesus in those days, but he wasn't the one in the biblical account. And another comment, this guy is full of crap. Jesus isn't even a name as far back as 500 years ago. The letter J wasn't in existence. King James Version 1611 is Iusus, but the Hebrew name is Yeshua.
Yeah, but I don't think it is Yeshua. I think they're stretching it. What we have from the Greek is, Iusus is how it's called in the Greek. And that's how it is in all of the proper New Testaments. I tend to use the King James Version because it's easier. Obviously, I'm English. But if I'm reading any difficult words, any controversial words, I go back to the Greek. And, of course, in the Greek, we have Iusus. I'm just saying Jesus because that's what everybody understands. But does this name link back to Yeshua? I'm not sure that it does. I think they've linked it to the name Joshua simply because they needed a link somehow to Judaism. He was supposed to be from the line of David. He was supposed to be a Judite from the line of David. But I don't think that's his name at all. I think his name actually came out of the Persian because he was a Persian king. Well, his mother was until she got thrown out of Persia. So 50% of his bloodline is Persian. And his name in the Persian was Isus. And that was his real name. And it was from Isus that if you go to Persia now, which is, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, in the Arabic, he's called Issa, which comes from Isus. And that was his real name. And from that, you get the Greek, which is I forget how to pronounce it now. And they were looking for a similar name within the Aramaic, within the Hebrew. And they couldn't really find one. And so they linked the name back to Joshua. And I don't think it's really linked to Joshua at all. And this separates the name Jesus from any other of the references within the Old Testament. So the name doesn't exist in Judaic history because it's not a Judaic name. And so his name is unique, and that's why it's translated as being unique within the New Testament. He's not called Joshua at all. He's called Jesus, Iusus. And it comes from the Persian Isa. And that was the name of the Edessan monarchy. The Edessan monarchs called him Manu, which is where we get Emmanuel from. And they called him Isa, which is where we get Isus from, Jesus. And several of the Edessan monarchs had the title or the name Isus. And that's where the name comes from.
I'm not sure I understand the comment, but someone here says it wasn't Edessa, but Idrisid Caliphate. So the Idrisids were an Arab Zaidi Shia dynasty of Morocco.
No. I think I know what the questioner is getting at, because if you read classical history and Roman history, they will say that the Edessans were Arabs. But I don't think they were Arabs at all. They didn't come from Arabia, they came from Babylon, which is why that Josephus calls them the Babylonian Jews. He does call them Arabs later on, but he normally calls them the Babylonian Jews. So where do we get these Arabs from? Well, it wasn't just Josephus and the Roman historians who called them Arabs, but so did the Acts of the Apostles calls them Arabs as well. So the name of the father of this king was called Abgarus. He was the patriarch of this dynasty, who lived he was king from AD 14 through to about AD 50. And his name was Abgarus. Now, in Acts of the Apostles, they call him Agabus. They swap the consonants around a little bit. And that's done deliberately because Agabus means locust. And when we look at the translation that Josephus is using, when they call them Arabs means locust. And so they're not actually calling this Edessan dynasty Arabs. They're calling them locusts. Why? Because this was traditional. And the Talmud does the same. The Talmud on 2 occasions calls the Edessan monarchy. And Jesus, in fact, they call Jesus a locust as well. Why? Because this was traditional Pesha. Within the Talmud, they tended to write a lot of things in code, and they use Pesha for this, which we've discussed before. So they will take characters from the past who have a similar history to the person you're talking about, and they will call you by that name. And the other thing they will do is they will transpose names to have a bit of wordplay, just for fun, but it also covers up the character you're talking about. So the Talmud can talk about Kamsa, and nobody needs to know that you're talking about Jesus. And so you can say terrible things about Kamsa, and nobody knows that you're talking about Jesus. But Kamsa happens again to mean locust. So why do we have all these references to locusts? Well, because it comes out of the Old Testament again. In the Old Testament, the locusts of the plagues, this is the 10 plagues of Egypt, the locusts of the plagues came out of the east and came to Judea and devastated Judea. Well, it devastated Egypt, I should say. So the locusts are a destructive force that comes out of the east and destroys the location you're at, which happened to be Egypt at that time. Now think about this story now in the 1st century with my new story of who this real Jesus was. He came out of the east because his mother was half Persian. So they came out of the east, they started a war with Rome, and they destroyed Judea. And so the Edessan monarchy, to the Roman historians and to Josephus and to the Talmudic historians, were exactly the same as the locusts of the plagues. And so this is why they've changed the name. And the Romans, I think, when the Romans were talking about this, didn't understand the humor that was being applied to these texts. And so they just called them Arabs. They didn't understand the context. But they're not being called Arabs at all. They're being called locusts.
The audience member chimes in. If Jesus didn't exist, then what is the origin of our calendar?
Well, yes. Well, he did exist, but yes,
Yeah, you're not saying he didn't exist.
No, but the question is still a good question, because I don't think that our calendar was based upon the Jesus character. Our present calendar was based upon processional astrology. And so this is another thing that they won't talk about within classical history. The very foundation of Judaism was built upon astrology and the zodiac. And we know this because of all of the synagogues in Jordan and Judea have zodiacs on the floor. And the best one we've talked about was the Hamat Tavera zodiac on the Sea of Galilee, which is a wonderful processional zodiac. And so the Jews, and I have to say this is probably more the Nazarene Jews, so this is the Church of Jesus and James, not necessarily the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem, but the Church of Jesus and James were venerating the zodiac. And it so happens that in AD 0, as it were, I say it's AD 10, but in AD 10, the symbol of Aries changed into Pisces. The lamb changed into the fish. And this is why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men, because he was acknowledging that he was the first king of Pisces, the first of the fisher kings from Arthurian history. which is why the Pope still wears the fisher ring, etc., and the fisher mitre. So this was all based upon processional astrology. And it so happens that we changed from one great month, the great month of Aries, into the next great month, the great month of Pisces, in AD 10. And so our calendars were actually reset at the beginning of the great month. And so really we are not 2017 AD, we're 2017 AP, Anno Pisces, after Pisces, because we're in the great month of Pisces. And then in 2350, I think it is, we change on to Aquarius. So it'll become the great month of Aquarius. So our calendar is based on astrology. Processional astrology has nothing, well, it has something to do with the Jesus character, because he was following that particular religion. But it's not exclusively based upon his birth at all.
Why does the world refuse to acknowledge the fact that King Solomon, King David, and Jesus Christ were black men?
Well, because they weren't black. This is a recent argument that's come up only in the last 20-odd years or so. Nobody prior to this ever would say that any of these monarchs were black. The Old Testament itself says that they were red, is the only commentary it does give. So that Esau and Solomon, King David were both red. And the Talmud says, not the Talmud, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls say that the new Messiah will be pale-skinned with freckles and red hair. It's quite obvious that this dynasty was a redhead dynasty. And this was confirmed because I linked this dynasty obviously back into Egypt and to the Amarna pharaohs of Egypt, who were linked to the Ramesside pharaohs who followed the Amarna dynasty. And the mummy of Ramesses II was taken to France about 10 years ago or more. Anyway, about 10 years ago, I think it was. And they took it there for restoration because it was beginning to be eaten away by microbes or something. So they took it to the police forensic laboratory, who took subcutaneous samples of his hair, and they found that Ramesses II was a true ginger-haired white man. So he again was pale-faced and ginger-haired. It seems almost certain that all of these monarchs were ginger-haired. And that's why, of course, we get the Renaissance pictures. If you look at a Renaissance picture of Mary Magdalene, she is always golden-haired, ginger-haired. Why? Because that was what they were. Same as if you look at Alexander the Great, who was probably actually linked to this dynasty. Alexander the Great was ginger-haired. There is no blackness whatsoever within any of the pharaonic dynasties or within the biblical dynasties, because obviously they're linked, because I say the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. But if you look at the descendants of the Hyksos, who are the Israelites, because I say they're the same, the descendants of the Israelites are quite obviously the Jews. And within all of Judaism, 99.9999% of all Jews are white-skinned people. They're not black at all. So this idea that somehow all of these biblical characters are supposed to be black is total nonsense. It's only been brought up in the last 20 years.
Now, you're referring to non-Sephardic Jews, or Sephardi too?
Well, all of them, because I regard the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews as being the same, because although they ended up close to the Black Sea, it's quite obvious, I think they've done from genetic studies and from cultural studies, that they were exiles from Judea many, many centuries ago, maybe exiles even from Egypt, because obviously I link these dynasties back into Egypt, that they were exiled on many occasions. So we had two major exiles out of Egypt. The first one was the Hyksos, who I say were the Israelites, and that's not just me. Josephus Flavius says exactly the same. Josephus Flavius says that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. And the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt were thrown out of Egypt on an exodus in about 1570 BC. And then we have the Amarna exodus, which I also link into biblical story, because I say that the brother of Akhenaten was Moses, because his name was Moses as well. And the Amarna dynasty was also thrown out of Egypt. And this was circa 1320 BC. And this is where we get the Scota, Egyptian queen of the Scots story from, that some of these exiles eventually found their way all the way around to Ireland and Scotland. So we have these two major exiles. And then we have the exile of the first century with the Jewish revolt, where the Romans threw out all of the Jews from Judea pretty much. So we have all of these exoduses going out of Egypt and out of Judea. And where did these exiles end up? Well, a lot of them ended up scattered across the Mediterranean. I have good reason to think that the Sea People were very closely linked to these Hyksos dynasties. And we have also these groups that went up towards the northeast, and they became the Ashkenazi. So I link them all back into these pharaonic dynasties. And so they're not separate cultures who have just taken on Judaism, as some people say. They are actually based upon exiles from Egypt.
Your whole position hinges on Paul being Josephus. Preposterous, says a member from the audience. Another says, the biggest stumbling block to the Josephus was Saul-Paul idea for me is Saul-Paul being a member of the Herodian family, while Josephus has never been known as one.
Yes, well, he was actually. The genealogies around the first century are very, very complex, because we had multiple marriages, multiple wives, and multiple wives marrying multiple kings. Some of them married 4 kings and so on. So it's a bit of a muddle. However, Josephus links himself back into the Hasmoneans. So he says he was of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, the Saul claim, Saul has no history within the biblical story. This Saul claim to be linked to the Herodians comes from Josephus Flavius, who writes about a character called Saulus. And Professor Eisenman has identified Saulus as being the biblical Saul. So he's talking about himself here. But there's a good reason why he can't call himself in that particular chapter, because it shows that he was a spy working for the Romans. So he didn't want to say who his real name was at that point. So he called himself Saulus. And as it happens, I agree with that, because I wrote about this 10 years ago or more. And I said Saulus has to be Saul, and therefore has to be Saul Josephus Flavius as well. And I didn't actually pick up at that point that the continuation of that story says that Saulus was linked to the Herodian family. He was of the family of Herod. I think it was you that pointed this out, actually. It was a couple of years ago or more when we were doing one of these talks, and you said that Saulus was Herodian. And anyway, it seemed like a stumbling block initially, but it is not really a stumbling block because why? Because the king involved, the Herodian king that Saulus would have been related to, was Agrippa II. This is the AD 40s, AD 50s. And Agrippa II, although he was Herodian, he was also Hasmonean as well, because the Hasmonean princess, Mariam I, married Herod the Great. And so Agrippa I and Agrippa II were Herodian and Hasmonean. They were linked. And so Josephus Flavius can also be linked to Agrippa II, because he would have been of the same family through the matriarchal line of Mariam I. So they would have been linked. They would have also been of the same family. And Jesus was also linked to this same family, because it's difficult to give the reasons. It's very complex. But in one of my books some years ago, I said that Mary Magdalene was married to Agrippa I before Agrippa I died. He died after a couple of years, and then she married Jesus. So again, this royal family was linked to the Herodian family because Mary Magdalene was married to Agrippa I. And of course, if you think of it in terms of dynastic alliances, this is exactly what these royal families would be doing. They would always be marrying off daughters to the king next door to have an alliance with their neighboring kings. It's just exactly what they did all the way through history. And we have a little snippet of this from Jesus, that he was linked to the Herodians as well, from the gospel stories. And what does he say? Here it is. It comes from Matthew 17:24 to 25. And Jesus is talking to Peter. And he says to Peter, "Do kings take taxes from their sons or from strangers?" And Peter says, "Well, from strangers, of course." And so Jesus says, "Well, then the sons are free of tax," meaning himself. So what Jesus is saying here is that as a son of the royal family, Jesus should not have to pay taxes. Why? And he would have been talking about the Agrippa kings here as well. Due to the chronological chasm, we're talking about the AD 50s here, not the AD 20s or 30s. So Jesus would have been talking about Agrippa II again. And he is saying, I don't have to pay tax because we're related to this king. How was he related to the king? Well, he was related possibly through the Hasmonean link, but he was also related because his sister, Mary Magdalene, was married to Agrippa I. So they were related. And Jesus makes that perfectly clear in Matthew 17:24-25. So, yes, can Saul be Josephus because Saul might have been related to the Herodians? Yes, of course, because they were intermarried.
Someone's saying, none of this could possibly be true because the Jesuits invented the cult of Jesus as a man-made control tool.
Well, yes, but that's going back to the at-will answer, isn't it? Because it can't be fictional, because otherwise the Talmud wouldn't be talking about it. The Romans don't talk about it, but the Talmud does, and there's no good reason at all for the Talmudic scholars to be writing about Jesus and Mary Magdalene if they didn't exist as historical characters. So we can be fairly sure that these were historical characters. The only reason people keep saying that they are fictional, like Atwill and like these people who mention the Jesuits, which I've heard of before, the only reason that people are saying that it is fictional is because they can't find the historical record that it's based upon. And so they've got no choice. You either have to say, well, it's faith and just believe it, or you say it's fictional because you can't find the real history. The real difference is that I've found the real history. And now we know who this character actually was. So you don't have to say it's fictional anymore. You can go back to the real history and say, well, does this match? Yeah, that matches. Does this match? Yeah, that matches as well. In fact, you can go through the whole history of the Edessan royal family and say, well, pretty much it all matches, all of it. And so now we don't have to say that this is just a fairy story, because we can see the real history. We can see the evidence. We can actually see the coins of Jesus. We can see a statue of Jesus. There was a statue of Jesus. I've got a picture in one of the books, the Jesus King of Edessa book, of one of the statues from Palmyra, which they've just gone and blown up, of course. So luckily this statue was rescued many, many years ago by the French, and it's sitting in the Louvre now. But we probably actually have a statue of the king of Edessa, who would have been the biblical Jesus. And so it's quite possible that we have real, tangible evidence for this particular character.
Another audience comment question. Was not circumcision and elitist incest derived from the Egyptians? If so, then it does tie Jesus to being a descendant of Cleopatra, and thus he may not even have been Semitic either.
Well, he could have been Semitic anyway, because the Hyksos, we think, probably were Semites who went down into Egypt. Now, I'm fairly agnostic on where the Hyksos actually came from, but historical history and the biblical history of Abraham both seem to indicate that these Hyksos people came down from Edessa, because they say that Abraham came from Haran in Syria, which is the town right next door to Edessa. And Abraham came down and went into Egypt, and he was the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. And so the Hyksos Egyptians may well have been Semitic. And of course, then I say this family end up back in Edessa, which is right next door to Haran, where they first came from. So yes, they could have been Semitic. Regarding circumcision, yeah, that was a Egyptian tradition, and we have that. But again, we have to ask ourselves, and I don't know the answer to this, was it a Theban Egyptian tradition, or did this also come from Haran with Abraham and the Hyksos? And was it more of a Hyksos pharaoh tradition than it was a southern Egyptian tradition? I don't know the answer to that. But yes, it was certainly an Egyptian that came out of Egypt and was maintained by all of the Jews, including the Nazarene Jews. And regarding the incest, yes, again, that was an Egyptian custom. And certainly we know it goes back as far as Akhenaten and the Amarna dynasty, because Akhenaten married 3 of his daughters, I think they were. And so, yes, they had incest in that era, and they had all the way through subsequent dynasties. Cleopatra also had a marriage with 2 of her brothers. So that was an incestuous marriage as well. And it carried on within Judaism, of course. Most of the Judaic kings had incestuous marriages. Agrippa I was married to his, well, he wasn't officially married, but he was married to his sister Berenice. Simon Magus was married to his sister. Jesus was married to his sister, because I say Mary Magdalene was his sister. And we even have this within the gospel stories as well. Again, this is a verse that you won't hear from the pulpit, because they're not going to tell you this, of course. It's too controversial. But if you have a look at 1 Corinthians 9:5, it says, and I'll read it here, this is Saul talking, Paul. Have we not the power to lead about a sister wife as well as the other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord do? So this is Saul asking why he can't have a sister wife. So he wants an incestuous marriage as well. Now, you'll find in the translations that they have changed this, because this is obviously quite a controversial verse, and this has been changed all over the shot. And you can always tell that when something's been interfered with, because every Bible you'll look at will have a completely different translation. And I've got about 16 Bibles here, and some of them will say a sister and a wife. Some will say a sister and a believer wife or something. Anyway, there's all sorts of weird translations for this. What else do they say? A believing wife is one of them. A believing wife. A Christian wife. It doesn't say that. It says a sister wife. And there are only 2 Bibles that I've got that actually translate it correctly from the Greek. And they are the Rotherham, what's the other one? The Derby. The Derby and the Rotherham are the only Bibles who translate this verse correctly. Because they are very literalist. They didn't care about what it actually meant. They just translated it very, very literally from the Greek. And from the Greek it comes out as sister wife. So Saul was looking for a sister wife, the same as the brethren of the Lord had. Why? Because Mary Magdalene was the sister of Jesus. So, yes, they kept the same traditions of incest as the Egyptian pharaonic line, because it kept the bloodline pure. And that's why they did it. Which, again, as the questioner says, shows that this particular monarchy came from...
Wait. Did he actually say Christ Jesus means King Jesus?
Yes, he did.
He follows up by saying, guys, please, the most rudimentarily studied of biblical adherents know that the designation Christ means either anointed, oily, or unctuous. That name or title, however, has absolutely nothing to do with royalty, rulership, or dominion. With all respect due to your guest, he's lost all credibility with this error.
The questioner will have to take that up with the authors of the Gospels, because the authors of the Gospels call Jesus a king at his birth and a king at his crucifixion. He is called the King of the Jews on 36 occasions, I think, within the Gospel stories. So why is he called a king if he's not a king? Quite obviously, he was a king, and that's why they call him a king. It's quite easy to grasp. And as far as the Christ is concerned, Christ, it means the anointed one, the same as the Messiah means the anointed one. But what is the anointed one? The anointed one is the anointed king, normally of the Jews, but not always the Jews, because if you look into the Old Testament, Saul was called the Messiah. Why? Because he was the anointed king of the Jews. But also they call one of the Persian kings the Messiah as well. I think it was Darius, I think, was called the Messiah. And Christ means the same. It means the anointed one. But it means the anointed priest or the anointed king of the Jews. And that's why Queen Elizabeth II was anointed in exactly the same fashion as Jesus was. She was anointed with oil. She is the anointed one. She is the Messiah. She is the King. She is the Christ, because she was anointed with oil at her coronation. And we also have a description of this coronation, because the coronation is when Jesus was anointed with oil, spikenard, at the house in Bethany. And that was his coronation. Now, it was only as it were, a back street coronation, because he was not a king. He didn't have a throne to sit upon at that time. And so they anointed him in a small ceremony at the house in Bethany. which actually I say was in Jordan, because if you read it in the Gospels in the original Greek, it says Bethabra. And Bethabra, it says, is east of the Jordan. So this was not Bethany near Jerusalem. It was Bethany across the Jordan. And so, yes, of course, he was a king. That's exactly what the Gospel says. Why would they ever call him a king if he wasn't a king? And if you want to go on to that, if you want to look at Renaissance art and have a look at any Renaissance art about especially Mary the Virgin, but also Mary Magdalene, and have a look at Renaissance art, and they are always wearing a crown. Not a crown of thorns this time, but a proper royal crown. So why does Mary Magdalene get a royal crown? Well, because she was a queen, of course. And that's why original texts like the Golden Legend says that Mary Magdalene was a queen who owned 2 castles in Judea. It was well known in these past eras that these were very wealthy aristocratic individuals.
To the audience, if you want to hear another one of these question and answer shows regarding Jesus King of Edessa, just post your questions in the comment section below, and if there are enough of them, if we get enough views, we'll surely do another show.
Sounds good to me, yeah. Sounds like fun.
Why, are you having fun?
Yeah, it's good, actually. It's good, actually, to see all of these diverse opinions, because as an author, you put out this information, and you don't know if it's going to take hold. You know, it's about the old parable about scattering grains of wheat, and some fall on stony ground and so on. And only a few of them actually start to sprout. Because you throw out this information, you don't know if people are going to understand it. You know, have you written it in a form that people will easily understand? Is it something that people can accept within the standard paradigm that they are working in? You know, if someone is a believer, are they going to be so challenged by this information that they're never going to accept it? So it's interesting to get the comments back and see how people actually view this, and where perhaps they're being tripped up by what I've said, you know, because you can write one thing and people can read it and think something totally different, you know, because they've read it in a different fashion. So it's very interesting to get the feedback and see where people are having problems, as it were, with the theory, that areas that they think need challenging. So, yeah, it's very good.
Last question here. There are certain letters of Paul, such as Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, in which Paul describes certain events that were also recorded in Acts. In them we see a certain level of intrigue regarding the theological aspects of the movement. Circumcision, the Acts 15 decision from James, the Acts 21 Nazarene vow, Paul's apostolic authority, to mention a few. Do you consider that to be something that happened or completely fictional?
Oh, it really happened. The genuine letters of Paul really happened. But what's interesting about the genuine letters of Paul is they don't give us the Jesus story. Now, isn't that a bit strange? Here was supposed to be somebody in the AD 50s. I put his first evangelical mission in AD 52, who was he was spreading the word to the communities around the Mediterranean in the AD 50s about his great hero God figure, who had been crucified by the horrible Jews and the Romans and risen again after 3 days. And yet on those journeys around the Mediterranean, he never mentions this once. Isn't that a bit strange? We never get this full story. There are a couple of instances where people have mentioned crucifixion within the letters of Saul Paul, but really most of those don't actually talk about crucifixion. They actually mention something else, and it's been retranslated as being crucifixion when it doesn't actually refer to it. But within all of those letters, we don't get this full story. You would have thought that this guy would be going around banging his drum saying, this was our Lord. He was scourged. He was tried. He was crucified. He died. He was taken down from the cross. He was put in a tomb, and he rose again in 3 days. All this sort of stuff. That would be his central message, wouldn't it? But it's not. If you read the letters, the genuine letters of Paul, he doesn't mention that complete story at all. Never. So why do we get this disconnect between what he should have been teaching and what he was actually teaching at that time? Well, because it hadn't happened yet. We fall into this chronological chasm once more. He wasn't talking about it because it hasn't happened. He was doing this evangelizing in the AD 50s, and Jesus was not crucified until AD 70. And we have his crucifixion story from Josephus, who says that he was crucified after the Jewish revolt had ended, which was in AD 70. And so he couldn't be writing about it in the AD 50s because it hadn't happened. And so this is yet further proof that this new interpretation I have, this new overcoming the chronological chasm, relocating the story into the late AD 60s, is actually correct. Because if I had made something up that was completely wrong, it would be contradicted on many occasions. And I would be tripping over myself all the time because of these great stumbling blocks. But it doesn't. Quite the reverse happens. I made this connection 20 years ago, back in 97, with Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs. And ever since that time, people have said, well, what about this? Well, actually, that fits. One of the big contentions was the age of Saul. And of course, he doesn't have to be born in AD 10 to be doing evangelical tours in AD 52. And so time and time again, all of the elements fit. And this is one of the key elements that does fit, is that the message that Paul is distributing in the AD 50s is not the correct message if the biblical chronology is correct. So, yeah, that's part of the evidence that Jesus was actually King Edessa of Edessa, and he was crucified in AD 70.
Well, that's it. That's the show. Great show, Ralph.
That's great. Yeah, it was nice. It's not, as I say, nice to have these questions. It's great stuff, yeah.
Ralph, before we go, remind the audience about the books, where they can find them, and how best to get in touch with you.
Yeah, so probably best to start with my website, which is edfu-books.com, edfu-books. All of the books are available on tablets, of course, your local iPad and Amazon's. They're also available in paperback, and they again come through Amazon, or you can get them from Adventures Unlimited, which is always a good source for all of these esoteric books. And we have a little bit of commentary going on my Facebook site, which is the Ralph Ellis 144 Facebook site, and there's a bit of commentary there as well, so you're welcome to join in. And yeah, there's 10, 12 books in the series now, so there's quite a few. And this is the King Jesus Trilogy is the title of the whole of the trilogy. And so that encompasses 3 books. And they're quite large, actually, some of these. They're 650 pages, some of them. So there's quite a lot of homework to be doing.
Great show, man. Ralph Ellis, once again, thank you so much for being a guest on the program.
Thanks very much for having me, Russell. Cheers.